Settlers. Chapter 9, Section 4. Neocolonialism and Leadership. The U.S. Empire has had a long and successful history of applying neocolonialism to hold down the oppressed. In Latin America and in New Africa during the mid-1800s, the U.S. Empire utilized neocolonialism, prior even to the advent of world imperialism. But in the 1920s and early 30s, U.S. imperialism's neocolonial instruments lost control over the African masses. In order to re-establish pro-imperialist leadership over African politics, U.S. imperialism had to forge new neocolonial instruments. These neocolonial instruments were not only traditional, but also radical and even socialistic in outward form, and had the special task of controlling the modern forces of African trade unionism and African socialism that had arisen so widely. We should remember that the essence of neocolonialism is an outward form of national self-determination and popular democracy, concealing a submissive relationship with imperialism on the part of the new bourgeois forces. As Amilcar Cabral pointed out almost 20 years ago concerning neocolonialism, beginning of quote, "The objective of the imperialist countries was to prevent the enlargement of the socialist camp, to liberate the reactionary forces in our countries which were being stifled by colonialism, and to enable these forces to ally themselves with the international bourgeoisie. The fundamental idea was to create a bourgeoisie where one did not exist, in order specifically to strengthen the imperialist and the capitalist camp." End quote. The U.S. Empire had literally done exactly that in the 1870s. The neo-colonial stage, known as Black Reconstruction, had qualitatively changed and enlarged the new African petty bourgeoisie. This class, even in defeat by the Euro-American planter capitalists, were to a degree held up and patronized by U.S. imperialism, and they retained, like a religion, their loyalty and dependence upon federal government. Washington, D.C. was their Mecca, or Rome. Indeed, the federal government was for many years the prime employer of the African petty bourgeoisie. Many African politicians of the 19th century were consoled by federal patronage jobs for the lost glories of Reconstruction. U.S. Senator Blanche Bruce from Mississippi was the last African in the Senate. When his term ended in 1881, Mississippi politics were back under planter control, and he was replaced. For his loyal example, the Empire awarded him the position in Washington of U.S. Register of the Treasury. For the next 32 years, that post would be reserved for loyal African leaders. Even Frederick Douglass was not immune to the ideological bent of his class. He was appointed U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia, and later in his life was U.S. Consul to Haiti. Small wonder that the former radical abolitionist spent years preaching how Africans should always remain loyal to the Republican Party, Northern Capital, and the federal government. By 1892, the federal offices in Washington employed some 1,500 Africans. While most of these jobs were as cleaning women and the lowliest of clerks, a trickle of professional and official positions were reserved for hand-picked African petty bourgeois leaders. Washington, D.C. was then the capital in exile of Africans, the center of, quote, Negro society. Some 8 bureaucratic positions with status eventually were reserved for them. D.C. Municipal Judge, Register of the Treasury, Deputy Register, Assistant District Attorney for D.C., Auditor of the Navy Department, Chief Surgeon at D.C. Freedmen's Hospital, Collector of Customs at Georgetown, and U.S. Assistant Attorney General. In 1913, a journalist lightheartedly labeled these 8, quote, the Black Cabinet. But what began in jest was eagerly taken up by petty bourgeois Africans in seriousness. The custom began of regarding the, quote, Black Cabinet as the representatives to the U.S. government of the whole African population within the U.S. So, a petty bourgeois African national leadership had been created, which was, in fact, both employed by and solely picked by the imperialist government. At this time, the most prominent African in these circles, standing in reality even above the, quote, Black Cabinet, was Booker T. Washington of Tuskegee Institute. Washington was viewed by the imperialists as their chief African advisor, and served them as a leading propagandist and apologist for white supremacy and colonialism. In return, any African who sought position or funds from the imperialists had to be approved by him. During the Theodore Roosevelt and Taft administrations, even the, quote, Black Cabinet appointments were cleared first with him. Washington had great fame and, acting for the empire, some influence over African education, newspapers, community institutions, and so on. But of course, neither he nor the other imperialist selected African leaders represented the will of the masses. At the end of World War I, an anti-colonial movement of incredible vigor burst forth, seemingly almost overnight, that rejected both the U.S. empire and the bourgeois leadership that it had installed for Africans. This was the historic movement touched off and led by the Jamaican Marcus Garvey. Even its enemies conceded that the African masses were expressing their deep desires through this rebellious movement of African nationalism. The Garvey movement at its peak in the early 1920s was the greatest outbreak of African political activity since the Civil War. It said that Africans could find their liberation in building a new, modern African nation of their own back on the soil of the African continent. The proposed nation would eventually unite and protect Africans everywhere, in the U.S. Empire and the West Indies, as well as on the African continent itself. This new nation would expand to liberate all Africa from colonialism and unite it into one continental African power. There, Africans would shape their own destinies in great industries, universities, agricultural cooperatives, and cultural institutions of their own. As a beginning toward the day, Garveyism organized national institutions here in all spheres of life. However modest, these medical, religious, military, economic, and other organizations were designed to develop African self-reliance and national independence. If Garveyism suffered from practical shortcomings, nevertheless its imposing sweep of vision expressed the burning national aspirations of the suppressed African peoples, and not only within the U.S., but worldwide. A picture of Booker T. Washington in his office at Tuskegee Institute, 1906. Garveyism's great contribution consisted of the fact that it raised high for all to see a vision of African life that was completely self-reliant, built around their own national economy and culture, that waited on no European to, quote, accept them or, quote, emancipate them. That was dependent solely on African energies and will. In this, Garveyism was expressing the strongest desires of the African masses. It is no accident that Garveyism and its successor, the Nation of Islam, were the two largest outbreaks of African activity and organization building within the continental empire of our century. Even such a self-admitted, quote, skeptic as Richard Wright was profoundly moved by Garveyism in his youth. Beginning of long quote. The one group I met during those exploring days whose lives enthralled me was the Garveyites, an organization of black men and women who were forlornly seeking to return to Africa. Theirs was a passionate rejection of America, for they sensed with that directness of which only the simple are capable that they had no chance to live a full human life in America. Their lives were not cluttered with ideas in which they could only half believe. They could not create illusions which made them think they were living when they were not. Their daily lives were too nakedly harsh to permit of camouflage. I understood their emotions, for I partly shared them. The Garveyites had embraced a totally racialistic outlook which endowed them with a dignity that I had never seen before in Negroes. On the walls of their dingy flats were maps of Africa and India and Japan, pictures of Japanese generals and admirals, portraits of Marcus Garvey in gaudy regalia, the faces of colored men and women from all parts of the world. I gave no credence to the ideology of Garveyism. It was, rather, the emotional dynamics of its adherents that evoked my admiration. Those Garveyites I knew could never understand why I liked them, but would never follow them, and I pitied them too much to tell them that they could never achieve their goal. It was when the Garveyites spoke fervently of building their own country, of someday living within the boundaries of a culture of their own making, that I sensed the passionate hunger of their lives, that I caught a glimpse of the potential strength of the American Negro. End of quote. The Garvey movement's ambitious economic ventures, in particular the ill-fated Black Star ship line, became centers of controversy. There is no doubt, however, that at the time they were often considered as very difficult but necessary steps for African progress. Even W.E.B. Du Bois of the NAACP, who was one of Garvey's favorite targets for scorn as a, quote, white man's nigger, initially spoke out in favor of Garvey's program, but not his personal leadership. Beginning of quote. The main lines of the Garvey plan are perfectly feasible. What he is trying to say and do is this: American Negroes can, by accumulating and administering their own capital, organize industry, join the black centers of the South Atlantic by commercial enterprise, and in this way ultimately redeem Africa as a fit and free home for black men. This is true. It is feasible. The plan is not original with Garvey, but he had popularized it, made it a living, vocal ideal, and swept thousands with him, with the intense belief in the possible accomplishment of the ideal. End of quote. To the extent that Garveyism was naive about capitalism, which obviously it was, to the extent that Garveyism was naive about capitalism, which it obviously was, This was a stage of development widely shared by its critics as well. Garveyism's weakness was that it saw in capitalism, the form of social organization of the colonizer, the instruments that Africans could use to free themselves. So that the essence of nation building was expressed in forms precisely paralleling those of European society. Businesses, churches, Black Cross, etc. Garvey's predilection for Western titles of nobility, Duke of Nigeria, and full-dress European court uniforms was but a symptom of this. While this made the concept of independent African nationhood instantly understandable, it also was a contradiction and a blind alley. Millions of Africans responded to the call of Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, read its newspaper, The Negro World, bought stock in its African business ventures, came out to its meetings and rallies. In 1920, some 50,000 Africans marched in a mass UNIA rally in Harlem. Garvey claimed 4.5 million members for the UNIA. His critics charged that an examination of the UNIA's public financial reports revealed that the Garvey movement had, quote, only 90,000 members, of whom, quote, only 20,000 were paid up at that time in dues. The UNIA was so overwhelming that its critics could try to belittle it only by saying that it had, quote, only 90,000 members. The UNIA's international effect was very profound. Claude McKay reminds us that, quote, in the interior of West Africa, new legends arose of an African who had been lost in America, but would return to save his people. End quote. On the Nigerian coast, Africans would light great bonfires, sleeping on the beaches, waiting to guide in the ships of, quote, Moses Garvey. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Ho Chi Minh of Vietnam both said that Garvey had been an important inspiration for them. Clemence Catterley, whose 250,000-member Industrial and Commercial Workers Union, ICU, was the first African working-class political organization in Azania, said that he had been much influenced by the UNIA. In British Kenya, the separationist Kikuyu Christians brought in UNIA ministers from the US to train and ordain their first ministers. And it was from these congregations that much of the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, called the Mau Mau by the British, would come a generation later. The Garvey movement, in Nkrumah's words, quote, raised the banner of African liberation on 3 continents. In Haiti, U.S. Marines violently put down the UNIA. In Costa Rica and Cuba, the United Fruit Company used police power to repress it. George Padmore, a bitter opponent of Garvey, recounts that, quote, in certain places, the punishment for being seen with a Negro world was 5 years at hard labor, and in French Dahomey it was life imprisonment. It was suppressed in such places as Trinidad, British Guiana, Barbados, etc., in the West Indies and all French, Portuguese, Belgian, and some of the British colonies of Africa. End quote. In the continental U.S., the Garvey movement was met with varying degrees of repression. Malcolm X's father, we should recall, was assassinated by the KKK because he was an organizer for the UNIA. But overall, U.S. imperialism moved against this surprising upsurge with some care. After several of Garvey's former lieutenants were suborned by the U.S. government, the imperialists had Garvey arrested for alleged mail fraud. This tactic opposing Garvey as a common criminal was conceived by none other than J. Edgar Hoover, who at that time was a rising FBI official. In an October 11, 1919 memorandum, Hoover noted that Garvey was, quote, agitating the Negro movement. Unfortunately, however, he has not as yet violated any federal law. It occurs to me, however, from the attached clipping, that there might be some proceeding against him for fraud in connection with his Black Star Line. End quote. Eventually, Garvey was convicted, imprisoned in Atlanta Federal Prison, and later deported in 1927. The door, however, had been opened. What was most apparent was that the old, conservative, imperialist-sponsored African leadership had been shoved aside and left behind by this outbreak. They could no longer even pretend to lead or control the African people. It is significant that even the liberal civil rights integrationists had been overshadowed by the new militant nationalism. This was a time of rich ideological struggle and transformation in the African nation. That, however, is not the precise focus of our investigation. What we are looking at is the neocolonial relationship between the forming petty bourgeois civil rights leadership and U.S. imperialism. We are analyzing how, in a time of mass unrest and the beginnings of rebellion amongst Africans, U.S. imperialism helped promote a neo-colonial African leadership that in outward form was integrationist, protest-oriented, radical, and even, quote, socialist. The political attack against the Garvey movement within the African nation was most aggressively spearheaded by a young African, quote, socialist and labor organizer, Asa Philip Randolph, who only used his first initial, A. Since those years of the early 1920s, Randolph, even then one of the leading African radical intellectuals, would grow in stature and influence. A. Philip Randolph became the organizer, and then the president, of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He would become for decades the most important African Union leader, eventually rising to be the only African member of the AFL-CIO Executive Council. As the leader of the historic 1941 March on Washington movement, he was credited with forcing the federal government to desegregate industry. To most today, Randolph is at best a dim name, somehow associated with dusty events in the past. In 1969, he had an 80th birthday dinner at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York, where he was personally congratulated not only by Coretta King and other African notables, but by Governor Nelson Rockefeller and AFL-CIO President George Meany. It's hard for activists today to view him as anything but another of the faceless Uncle Toms. This greatly underestimates his historic role. To grasp how useful he was to the U.S. empire, we have to see that the young A. Philip Randolph was a radical star in the African community. He was an angry, provocative troublemaker, with an image as bold as a James Foreman or a Cesar Chavez. Randolph published the first socialist African journal aimed at workers, promoting African unionism, The Messenger carried the motto, quote, "the only radical Negro magazine in America," and had 45,000 readers. He was arrested and briefly held by federal authorities for speaking out against World War I. The New York State Legislature's investigative committee called him, quote, "the most dangerous Negro in America." Randolph did his work inside the African struggle, as a radical mass leader, not as a conservative talking conciliator sitting in a fancy office somewhere. His long tenure as the lone recognized African leader on a, quote, national level in the AFL-CIO was so striking that it led the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. to query in an article why, quote, "the absence of Negro trade union leadership. 85% of Negroes are working people. Some 2 million are in trade unions. But in 50 years, we have produced only one national leader, A. Philip Randolph." End quote. This is a question whose answer will become apparent to us. At the beginning of Randolph's political career, this ambitious young intellectual was taken in and helped by the UNIA. Garvey appointed him as head of the UNIA delegation to the League of Nations Conference at the end of World War I. Randolph was denied a U.S. passport and was unable to go. When Randolph and his close associate Chandler Owen needed assistance for the Messenger, the UNIA provided them with offices in the Harlem building that it owned. The UNIA attempted to be broadly encouraging to African ventures, even those of a socialist nature, so long as they were African-run and oriented. A picture of A. Philip Randolph, 1889 to 1979, president of the general organizer of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Another picture, W.E.B. Du Bois seated in his office at The Crisis. Randolph's integrationism and ambition led him to break with the UNIA. It was not, we should emphasize, only a political struggle within the African ranks alone. The U.S. oppressor nation was also involved in the dispute. While Randolph and his fellow integrationists, totally impressed with the might of the U.S. empire, never believed that national liberation could succeed. They feared that the growing mass agitation would antagonize settlers. To these neocolonialists, settler, quote, goodwill and patronage was more important than almost anything. Further, Randolph's immediate career as a would-be labor leader was threatened by Garveyism's hold on the African masses. Randolph and his associates were fanatically determined to destroy Garvey and the UNIA at any cost. They pursued this end using any and every means. In their magazine, The Messenger, Garvey was sneeringly referred to as, quote, monumental monkey, and, quote, supreme Negro Jamaican jackass. Randolph's near-racist rhetoric reflected his assertion that Garvey was an, quote, alien, West Indian, and not a true, quote, American Negro. National speaking tours with the NAACP for a, quote, Garvey must go campaign failed. In a telling move, Randolph, the supposed, quote, socialist, and his integrationist allies turned to the U.S. empire for help. They openly encouraged the repression of the UNIA. In early January 1923, this grouping became alarmed when the chief government witness against Garvey in his coming mail fraud trial was killed. This traitor, Reverend J.W. Easton of New Orleans, had formerly been a leader in the UNIA, but had been ousted for embezzlement. The dying Easton had allegedly identified his assailants as two workers, a longshoreman and a painter, who were UNIA security cadre. The anti-Garvey grouping was seized with fear that they themselves would be corrected for their treasonous collaboration with the state. On January 15, 1923, constituting themselves as, quote, a committee of 8, they wrote to U.S. Attorney General Dougherty, begging him to strike down the African nationalists without any delay. This historic letter is informative. Beginning of long quote. Dear Sir, 1. As the chief law enforcement officer of the nation, we wish to call your attention to a heretofore unconsidered menace to harmonious race relations. There are in our midst certain Negro criminals and potential murderers, both foreign and American born, who are moved and actuated by intense hatred of the white race. These undesirables continually proclaim that all white people are enemies to the Negro. They have become so fanatical that they have threatened and attempted the death of their opponents. 2. The movement known as the Universal Negro Improvement Association has done much to stimulate the violent temper of this dangerous movement. Its president and moving spirit is one Marcus Garvey, an unscrupulous demagogue, who has ceaselessly and assiduously sought to spread among Negroes distrust and hatred of all white people. 5. The UNIA is chiefly composed of the most primitive and ignorant element of West Indian and American Negroes. Continued. 25. For the reasons above, we advocate that the Attorney General use his full influence completely to disband and extirpate this vicious movement, and that he vigorously and speedily push the government's case against Marcus Garvey for using the mails to defraud. Its future meetings should be carefully watched by officers of the law, and infractions promptly and severely punished. End of quote. The 8 who signed this slavish appeal, Randolph dishonestly professed to know nothing about it, were Chandler Owen, co-editor of The Messenger and Randolph's closest political associate, William Pickens, field secretary of the NAACP, Robert Bagnall, NAACP director of branches, Robert Abbott, publisher of the Chicago Defender, Julia Coleman, Hair Vim Cosmetics Company, John Nail, real estate broker, George W. Harris, New York City Councilman, editor of the newspaper New York News, Henry Pace, Pace Phonograph Company. It is useful to examine this move. In practice, it turned out that Randolph's grouping of moderate, quote, socialists, supposedly dedicated to overthrowing capitalism, were blocked with the liberal, pro-capitalist, petty bourgeois elements of the NAACP, and with the marginal African business interests who fed off the degradation of colonial oppression. And that in practice all these elements looked upon the U.S. empire as their ultimate protector against their own people. While it is obviously true that Randolph was an agent of U.S. imperialism, it wasn't true that he was just a simple tool following orders, such as a police informer might be. To understand neocolonialism, we have to see that Randolph represented a certain class viewpoint. the viewpoint of Muñoz Marin in Puerto Rico, or the young Mike Masaoka in the Japanese-American national minority. This is a viewpoint of the section of the petty bourgeois that sees advancement and progress not from leaving the struggle, but from co-opting it and using it as a bargaining tool in winning concessions from the empire in return for loyal submission. It is only a seeming paradox that these activist petty bourgeois elements encouraged and needed both democratic struggles and violent repression. They are the leaders that U.S. imperialism promotes to ensure that even third world protest and organization is ultimately loyal to it. A. Philip Randolph's career makes us recall Cabral's warning that, quote, imperialism is quite prepared to change both its men and its tactics in order to perpetuate itself. It will kill its own puppets when they no longer serve its purposes. If need be, it will even create a kind of socialism, which people may soon start calling neo-socialism. End quote. Randolph became a leading advocate of all African unionism and political organizations. He publicly argued against integrated civil rights organizations, such as the NAACP, on the grounds that only Africans should decide how their struggle was conducted. But his goal was only to weld Africans together as a bloc, so that he and his fellow pro-imperialist leaders could demand a price from the U.S. empire in return for African submission. Randolph's integrationistic, quote, socialism was used to fill a void, to ideologically portray a far-off, glittering social vision to African workers that didn't relate to national liberation or breaking away from the U.S. empire. Randolph had been indoctrinated in Euro-American social democracy and settler unionism. That is, he shared the Euro-American reformist view on how social betterment for Africans should take place. Randolph argued that Africans could be protected by unionism and civil rights if they carefully convinced settlers of their nonviolent submissiveness and their desire to be ruled by Euro-Americans. While the Messenger abused both communism and nationalism in print in the most vulgar and crude ways, towards AFL President Samuel Gompers, who was a segregationist, an open advocate of white supremacy, and a public spokesman of the doctrine of the, quote, racial inferiority of Africans, Randolph was never less than humble and praising. In 1924, when Gompers died, the Messenger excused him as a diplomatically silent friend. Randolph feared and hated the Garvey movement, not because of its faults, but because of its virtues. A picture of a strike notice, BSCP strike notice, Detroit, June 7th, 1928. All this is made abundantly clear by Randolph's relationship to Gompers' successor, AFL President William Greene. Morehouse College professor Brailsford Brazeal admitted in his laudatory 1946 book on the Porters' Union, quote, Randolph, although a socialist, had by this time convinced Greene that Pullman porters were anxious to demonstrate that the Negro would help to further the programs of American workers through conventional channels. Randolph had condemned the communists and their tactics in the message. Randolph had condemned the communists and their tactics in the Messenger. All this must have reaffirmed Greene's convictions that here were the man in the organization that could serve as an instrument for rallying Negro workers under the hegemony of the Federation. End quote. Bayard Rustin, Randolph's leading disciple, has said of him, quote, "He realized that separatism, whether espoused by Marcus Garvey or latter-day nationalists, is grounded in fantasy and myth despite its emotional appeal to an oppressed people. Black people, he realized, could never advance without the good feelings and assistance of many whites." End quote. And now we can see the answer to the question that Dr. King raised. There was only one A. Philip Randolph because U.S. imperialism only wanted one. Randolph was pushed forward and made a big leader by his Euro-American mentors. When we look at his magazine, The Messenger, during the years when it was fighting Garveyism, we see in issue after issue large, quote, solidarity advertisement paid for by the Euro-American radicals, who ran the International Ladies Garment Workers Union and Amalgamated Clothing Workers Union. Social democratic settler labor was indirectly subsidizing Randolph to attack nationalism from within the African nation. To be their agent and do what they from the outside could not. His whole career was similarly aided and arranged. Imperialism needed its own militant-sounding African leaders. A. Philip Randolph's actual record as president of the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters is instructive. He and Chandler Owen were approached by a committee of porters who were looking for an African intellectual who could help them organize a union. The porters' previous attempts had been clumsy. Several efforts had been smashed by the company in a series of firings. Randolph took up the opportunity, and in 1925 the union was formed. The Messenger became the official journal of the Brotherhood. In terms of leading labor struggles, Randolph was a peculiar, quote, success. After years of difficult building, the new 7,000-member union had called for a coast-to-coast Pullman strike in 1928. A mood of tense anticipation was prevalent among the porters, knowing that the settler train crews wouldn't honor their strike and would try to roll the trains anyway. Large groups of African workers began arming themselves and preparing to take over the rail yards in Oakland and on the East Coast. Randolph was upset, for he had never really intended to lead a strike. He had not prepared for one, and had told union associates that it was all a bluff. He felt certain that the Federal Mediation Board would step in and arrange a negotiated settlement, just as they did for the Euro-American Railroad Brotherhoods. As a precaution, Randolph had even had a White House meeting with President Coolidge and told him of his secret hopes for a government-sponsored settlement. But as the strike deadline neared, the federal government refused to intervene. The imperialists were unwilling to publicly admit that an African union could force a, quote, national emergency. As a desperate hope, Randolph then went begging to AFL President William Greene. In a last-minute meeting, he implored Greene for AFL support of the porter strike, getting the settler railroad brotherhoods to close down the trains. Greene told him that, quote, the public isn't ready to accept a strike by Negroes. He told Randolph to give up and call off the strike. Randolph sadly obeyed. On the eve of the first coast-to-coast strike of African railroad workers, the word went out to go back to work and offer no resistance to the companies. Disillusioned and confused, the African porters left the Union by the thousands. 2/3 of the Union's 7,000 members quit in the next few months. Randolph's only plan was for them to wait and wait until Euro-Americans decided to finally approve of them. Many porters were fired by the triumphant company, knowing that Randolph had left them defenseless. Dues slowed to a trickle, and even the messenger stopped appearing. A. Philip Randolph had won acceptance from the AFL leadership, but the workers who had followed him paid the bill. And he had succeeded in diffusing a potentially explosive struggle of African workers. Randolph's vindication came with the New Deal, with the entry into state power of liberal Democratic Party politicians who understood him and why he was so useful. In 1937, the National Labor Relations Board ordered the Pullman Company to recognize the Brotherhood and give in to its main demands. During this same period, we should note, African nationalists in the North, who were trying to form unions independent from Euro-American unionism, were subjected to both legal and police disruption. Under the imperialist-ordered settlement, porters' wages went up by 30%, while working hours were cut. Randolph was promoted as the very successful leader of an all-African union, who had gotten his members sizable rewards in wages and working conditions. His greatest hour of fame lay still ahead, the 1941 March on Washington movement, when for 1 month, Randolph was the most important African in the U.S. This was the event that ensured him a place as a national leader of Africans for the U.S. Empire. Instead of Booker T. Washington, an avowed, quote, socialist, labor leader was now meeting and advising at the White House. So a new militant nationalism and a new protest-oriented integrationism engaged in ideological struggle for leadership of the African masses. It was not, however, a symmetrical struggle, or an equal one. Struggle rarely is. The insurgent nationalism had the far greater share of popular support, particularly from the laboring masses. It was also true that African revolutionaries of that time had not yet developed successful strategies for liberation. The civil rights integrationists, however slim their own forces, had the powerful resources of the oppressor nation backing their play. The full range of forces, from the U.S. Department of Justice and police to the foundations, the Social Democrats, and the settler trade unions, all worked in their various ways to promote the hegemony of a modernized neocolonial leadership allied to the U.S. empire. A picture of a BSCP strike cancellation by the order of A. Philip Randolph. End of section 4.